My name is Marlo Avery. I am 44 years old. On a Thursday morning in January, 11 months ago, my phone rang at 6:52 in the morning while I was getting ready for work, standing in my bathroom in Memphis, Tennessee with a toothbrush in my hand and the specific blue-gray light of a January morning coming through the frosted window above the sink. The number was my sister's. My sister's name is Renee. She is 41. The last time we had spoken was at our mother's funeral 4 years ago, in the specific brief exchange of two people at a funeral who share an obligation to be in the same room and who have not resolved the thing between them that made the room necessary in the first place. We had said the things that people say at funerals. We had not said the things that needed to be said between us. We had left the church separately, and we had not called each other afterward. The 4 years before the funeral were the years of the estrangement. The 4 years before the estrangement were the years of the crisis. The 4 years before the crisis were the years of our ordinary sisterhood, the relationship we had built across childhood and our 20s, imperfect and specific and ours, before everything changed. 8 years from crisis to this phone call. 8 years of building my life without my family's help, because my family's help had not been available when I needed it most, and I had eventually stopped needing it in the way I once had, though stopping needing it had not made the original absence hurt less, only more bearable. I looked at her name on my screen. I answered. She said, "Marlo." I said, "Renee." She said, "I didn't know who else to call." I said, "Tell me what happened." Before I tell you what she said and what I did and what we found out over the following weeks, let me take you back to the beginning. Because the beginning is where the specific shape of everything that happened afterward was already determined, and because the beginning is where the thing that mattered most about my family became visible for the first time. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, the older of two daughters born to Gerald and Patricia Avery, who had married in 1977 and built the specific middle-class Nashville life of their generation, comfortable and specific in the way of families that have done the expected things in the expected order and have received, in return, the expected stability. My father was a mortgage loan officer for a regional bank for 31 years. My mother was a dental hygienist for 24 years, and then a practice manager for the same dental group for 11 years after that. They were practical people with a specific relationship to money that I want to describe accurately because it shaped both what they valued and how they responded to situations they had not anticipated and did not have a framework for. They valued stability. The specific, documented, verifiable form of stability that came from steady employment and home ownership and the accumulation of modest assets through 30 years of consistent saving. They were not wealthy. They were secure, and the security they had built was something they had built deliberately and carefully, and they had, I understand now with an adult understanding I did not have then, a specific difficulty with situations that threatened the feeling of that security, even when the situations themselves were not actually threatening anything. Renee and I had a normal sisterhood in the specific way that sisters who are 3 years apart in age and who are not particularly similar in temperament have a normal sisterhood, which is to say close in childhood, increasingly divergent in adolescence, and eventually the relationship of adults who share a history but not a daily life. Renee was more gregarious, more immediately warm, more skilled at managing the emotional atmosphere of a room, the specific combination of qualities that made her the easier child, in the way that one child is always easier than the other, when they are better suited to the environment their parents have created. I was quieter and more specific in my interests, and less immediately warm, and more likely to say the true thing in a situation, where the true thing was not what anyone wanted to hear, which made me, in the economy of the family my parents had built, the more difficult child in the specific sense of requiring more management rather than producing more natural alignment. I loved my family. I want to state this plainly because what I am about to describe could be read as a story of people I did not love, and that would be the wrong reading. I loved my parents, and I loved my sister in the specific way that people love the people they grew up alongside, the particular intimate love of shared history, imperfect and irreplaceable. What I did not know until my crisis arrived was the specific limits of that love when tested by something my family did not have the framework to manage. The crisis came in 2011, when I was 32 years old. I had been working for 6 years as a graphic designer at a mid-size marketing agency in Nashville, where I had built a reputation for the specific kind of work that required both technical skill and creative judgment, the kind that attracted clients who knew the difference between adequate and excellent. I had a salary that was comfortable for someone my age in Nashville. I had savings, modest but real. I had an apartment that was mine, and a professional life that was building towards something I could see the shape of. I also had a relationship that had been building towards something I could not see the shape of, with a man named Curtis who was charming and specific and who had, across 2 years of dating, produced in me the specific kind of attachment that I had not felt before and that I did not, in retrospect, examine with the appropriate skepticism that any attachment that's strong in that early a relationship deserved. Curtis and I moved in together in January 2011. By August 2011, I had lost my apartment, my savings, my job, and my credit. I am not going to describe the specific mechanism of how this happened, because the mechanism is both common and humiliating in the specific way of things that are common and humiliating. The way of someone who trusted someone who was not trustworthy, and who did not discover the untrustworthiness until the discovering was too late to prevent the damage it produced. I will tell you only the specific facts that are relevant to this story. Curtis had a problem I had not known about. The problem had a direct impact on our shared finances in ways that I did not understand until they were already fact. By September 2011, I was 32 years old, and living on a friend's couch in Nashville with $400 in a bank account and no apartment and no job, and the specific numbness that acute financial crisis produces in someone who has spent 6 years building a life that has just been entirely dismantled. I called my parents. I want to describe this call accurately because it is the call that determined everything that followed in this story, not the 6-minute call. The specific quality of what was in the 6 minutes, my mother answered. I told her what had happened. I told her specifically, because I had decided that the only way to ask for help was to ask for it directly with full information. And so I told her about Curtis and what I had found out, and what the damage was and what I needed, which was somewhere to stay for a few months while I rebuilt, and possibly a small loan to cover my first and last on a new apartment when I found one. My mother was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said the specific thing that I have thought about many times since, not because it was cruel, it was not meant as cruelty, but because of what it revealed about the limits of the framework she and my father had built for managing situations they had not anticipated. She said, "Marlo, I have to talk to your father about this. We'll call you back." They called back 2 days later. My father said, "We've talked about it, and we think the best thing we can do is to let you handle this yourself. We don't think it would be good for you if we stepped in, because you need to learn to make better decisions, and having us bail you out would prevent that learning." I said, "Dad, I need somewhere to stay." He said, "We think it's important for you to find that on your own." I said, "Dad, I don't have anywhere to go." He said, "We believe in you. We know you'll figure it out." I held the phone in my hand in my friend's living room in Nashville, and I sat with what my father had just said, and I understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has just received information they cannot unreceive, that the framework my parents had built for managing the world did not include a provision for a daughter who had arrived at genuine crisis, through no singular fault of her own, and who needed the specific form of help that parents with resources can sometimes provide. I did not call them back. I figured it out on my own because I had to, in the specific way that people figure things out when they have no other option. A second friend's couch for 6 weeks. A temp position that became a permanent position at a different agency. A studio apartment, saved for month by month across 6 months of the temp salary. a slow, specific, difficult rebuild of everything I had lost. It took 3 years. During those 3 years, my parents and Renee were present in my life in the specific, reduced way of people who have decided that their presence should be limited because the situation requires the struggling person to struggle through it without help. They called occasionally. They came to Nashville for Thanksgiving and Christmas in the first year, more briefly in the second, and less in the third. The calls became the specific calls of people maintaining a relationship rather than sustaining one. Renee, I learned later through mutual friends, had been told by my mother that I was working through some personal difficulties and that it was important to give me space. She had accepted this framing. She had not called me directly to ask what was actually happening. She had given me the space my mother had suggested was important. I had not asked for space. I had asked for somewhere to stay. By the time I emerged from the 3 years of rebuilding, I had a different understanding of my family than I had brought into the crisis. Not bitterness, exactly. A specific, realistic assessment of what was available and what was not. I adjusted my life accordingly. The estrangement was not a decision I made. It was the specific result of adjusting my life to the reality of what was available, which meant that I invested my energy in the people and relationships that had actually been present during the crisis years, and my family gradually became people I saw at holidays and who occupied the background of my life rather than its center. My mother died 4 years ago. The funeral was in Nashville. Renee was there. We said the things people say at funerals. We left separately. When Renee called at 6:52 on a Thursday morning in January, I had not spoken to her in 4 years. I answered because she is my sister. That is the specific, complete reason. Whatever had happened between us, and whatever had not happened, and whatever the specific history of the crisis and the space, and the adjusting away from each other, she is my sister. And the specific, unbreakable nature of that is not something I have ever questioned, even when I was questioning everything else about my family. She said, "Marlo." I didn't know who else to call. I said, "Tell me what happened." She said, "Kevin's gone. He took everything and he's gone and I don't know how to—" She stopped. She started again. "I went to the bank yesterday. He had moved everything. The joint account, the savings, the investment account he managed. It's all gone. There's $700 left in my checking account, and the mortgage is due in 3 weeks, and the kids' school tuition is due, and I have $700. I said. "How long has this been happening?" She said. "I don't know. I found out yesterday. I went to the bank because a payment bounced, and the woman at the counter told me the account had been reduced to $700, and I said that was impossible. And she showed me the transfers, and I stood at the counter, and I couldn't breathe." I said, "When did Kevin leave?" She said, "I think 3 weeks ago. He said he was traveling for work. He does that. He travels. I didn't know until—" She stopped again. "I thought everything was fine. I thought we were fine." I said, "Okay. I need you to take a breath and tell me specifically what you know." She told me. All of it. The transfers she had seen at the bank, approximately $240,000, moved across 3 months in transactions she had not seen because Kevin managed the finances and she had not been involved in the accounts. The mortgage in her name only, which meant the mortgage obligation was hers. The car payments, both in his name, which meant those were his problem, but also that she no longer had access to one of the 2 cars. The children, a boy who was 9 and a girl who was 6. The school tuition, paid annually, which was coming due. I listened to all of it. I wrote down the specific numbers on a notepad I keep on my kitchen counter. When she finished, I said, "Renee, where are you right now?" She said, "I'm at home." I said, "Do you have food in the house?" She said, "Yes." I said, "The kids are safe?" She said, "They're at school. They don't know anything." I said, "Okay, I need you to do one thing right now, and then we're going to talk about what comes next." She said, "What?" I said, "I need you to send me the name of the bank and the account numbers and your address. Just those 3 things. Can you do that?" She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm going to help you figure out what to do, and I need those things to figure it out properly." She said, "Marlo, I know I don't have the right to call you." I said, "You're my sister. Stop." She said, "After everything that happened." I said, "Renee, send me the bank information and your address. We'll talk about the rest later." She sent me the information. I want to tell you about the 3 days after that phone call, before I tell you about the conversation that changed what I understood about those 3 days, because the 3 days and the conversation are both necessary to the full story. I am a financial planner. I have been a financial planner for 12 years, the specific career I built after the crisis years, the work I chose specifically because of what the crisis years had taught me about financial systems, and how they failed people who did not understand them, and how understanding them could prevent specific forms of devastation that ignorance made possible. I work at a firm in Memphis with a practice focused on women navigating financial transitions, the specific work of someone who understood financial transition from the inside and who wanted to be the person that other people could call when they found themselves inside one. I knew exactly what to do. Not because Renee's situation was simple. It was not. It was the specific complicated mess that financial betrayal by a spouse produces. But because I had spent 12 years building the specific professional expertise that made the complicated mess mappable and the map actionable, I took a personal day on Thursday. I called my colleague David, who handled divorce financial planning, and I described the situation without identifying Renee and asked him to be available for a consultation that afternoon. I called a family law attorney in Nashville named Catherine Howard, who had been a client of mine and whom I trusted specifically. I called a forensic accountant named James Whitmore, who had worked several cases with us. I drove to Nashville on Friday. Renee was home when I arrived, the specific appearance of someone who has not slept in 2 days and who has been holding herself together for children who do not know what is happening. She looked at me in the doorway of her house, and I watched her face do the specific thing that faces do when the person they belong to has been managing alone and has just encountered someone who is going to take some of the managing. She said, "You came." I said, "Of course I came." We sat at her kitchen table for 6 hours. I went through everything she had. The bank statements she had requested, which showed the full history of the transfers, the mortgage documents, the investment account statements she found in a file cabinet, the kids' school contract, Kevin's last known employment information, the specific accumulated financial picture of a 12-year marriage that I mapped with the specific methodical attention of someone who does this work professionally and who was also sitting across from her sister. By evening, I had a complete picture of the situation and a specific plan of action organized across 4 categories: immediate stabilization, legal process, financial recovery, and ongoing management. I called Catherine Howard that evening. She agreed to take the case and to waive her retainer until Renee had access to marital assets through the legal process. I called James Whitmore. He agreed to begin the forensic accounting work on Monday. I called a friend who was a principal at Renee's children's school and explained the situation without specifics and asked whether the school had provisions for families in acute financial crisis. The school had a hardship fund. The tuition would be deferred. I made 4 phone calls, solved 3 immediate problems, and created a plan for the rest. Renee sat across the kitchen table from me and watched me do this, and she said, at some point during the 4th call, "You're really good at this." I said, "I know." She said, "How did you get this good at this?" I said, "I'll tell you later. First, let's finish the calls. Let me stop here for a moment and ask you something directly. Have you ever had to help someone who did not help you when you needed help, and discovered in the helping something about yourself that you could not have discovered any other way? Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what I am about to tell you is not about Renee's crisis. It is about what happened in a conversation we had on Saturday evening, after the calls and the plan and the children's school and the first steps of the legal process were in motion, when we were sitting on her back porch with 2 glasses of wine that I had brought from Memphis, because I had known we were going to need something to sit with after the work was done. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. Renee said, I need to tell you something about 2011. I looked at her. She said, I know you think I chose not to call you. During those years. I know that's what it looked like. I want to tell you what actually happened, I said. Renee, you don't have to, she said. I do. Let me say it. I waited, she said. When everything happened with Curtis, Mom called me. She told me you were going through a difficult personal situation and that you needed space and that the most supportive thing we could do was to give you that space while you worked through it. She said you had asked for space. I said, I didn't ask for space. She said, I know that now. I didn't know it then. I believed her because why would I think she was lying to me? She was our mother. I thought if you needed something different, you would have called me directly. I said, I called them. She said, I know. I said I called them and asked if I could stay with them, and Dad said no. She said, I know that now too. I said, how do you know it now? She was quiet for a moment. She said, after Mom died. I was going through her things, her papers, her files. She kept everything, you know how she was. I said yes. She said, I found letters. She wrote letters even when she could have emailed. She always wrote letters. I found a letter she had written to her sister, Aunt Doris, about your situation in 2011. She was asking Doris for advice, and in the letter she described what you had asked for and what Dad had decided and why. I said, what did it say? Renee said, she said you had called and asked to stay with them and that Dad felt it would set a bad precedent if they helped because you had made choices that had led to the situation and they needed to let you experience the consequences. She said, and then she said something else. She stopped. I said, tell me. She said she told me you needed space because she didn't want me to help you either. She said if I helped you, it would undermine what she and Dad were trying to do. She said she needed me to stay back. I looked at my sister. I said, she told you I asked for space so that you wouldn't help me. She said, yes. The back porch of Renee's house in Nashville in January, cold in the specific way of Tennessee. January evenings that are not winter in the northern sense, but are cold enough that you want something warm in your hands. The wine. The yellow light through the kitchen window. The specific quiet of a house with sleeping children. I said, did you know? Before the letter? She said, no. I believed her. I thought you wanted space. I called you a few times in the first year and you were always, I said, I was angry. She said, I know. I thought it was because of the situation with Curtis. I didn't understand it was because of us. I said, I thought you were making the same choice they were. She said, I know. I understand why you thought that. We sat with this for a long time. The specific sitting with that the revelation required. The recalibration of 8 years of a specific understanding of what had happened. The particular vertigo of discovering that the story you have been living inside had a different shape than the one you believed. I said, why didn't you look for the letter sooner? She said, I didn't know there was anything to look for. I didn't know the space story was a lie until I found the letter. And by the time I found the letter, you and I hadn't spoken in 4 years, and I didn't know how to call you and say I found a letter that explains something that happened 8 years ago. I didn't know how to begin that conversation. I said, you began it tonight. She said, you drove 5 hours to help me first. I couldn't receive that without telling you. I sat with my sister on her back porch in January, and I thought about 8 years of a specific understanding of my family that had been organized around a particular reading of what had happened in 2011, and what my parents had done, and what Renee had chosen, and I held the new reading against the old one and tried to find where they fit together. My parents had not helped me. That was still true. My father had said what he had said and done what he had done, and the damage of those specific years was real and had shaped everything that came after it. That had not changed. What had changed was Renee. Renee had not chosen to leave me. Renee had been told I wanted to be left. I want to tell you about the rest of that evening, because there is more of it, and the more of it matters. I said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." I said, "When you found the letter, what did you feel?" She said, "I was angry at Mom for lying to me, for using me as part of how she managed the situation." She said, "And I was sad for what we lost. 8 years." She said, "And I was ashamed. Because even if I believed what she told me, I should have called you directly and asked. I should have been the one who found out whether you wanted space or whether you needed something else. I outsourced that question to her, and I shouldn't have. I said, 'She was our mother.' She said, 'Yes.' And I was an adult. I could have called you and asked." I said, "I probably would have been angry." She said, "I know. I should have let you be angry. I should have called anyway." I said, "Why didn't you reach out after you found the letter?" She said, "Because I was afraid." I said, "Of what?" She said that it was too late, that you would hear it and it would hurt more than it helped, that I had waited too long and that the letter explained something, but it didn't fix it, and maybe some things don't get fixed and I should just let it be and not make it worse by bringing it up. She said, "And then Kevin left and I had $700 and I needed help and the only number I was willing to call was yours." I said, "Why mine?" She said, "Because you're the only person I know who would come." I sat with that for a long time. I said, "Renee, I need to tell you something about why I drove here." She said, "You told me. I'm your sister." I said, "That's true, and that's the main reason. But I want to tell you the other part." She said, "Okay." I said, "When you called at 6:52 on Thursday morning, the first thing I felt was recognition, not surprise. Recognition. I recognized the call." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean, I had made a version of that call to people who didn't come. And I recognized the specific situation of making a call when you have nowhere else to go. And I knew what it felt like to make that call and not have anyone come, and I was not going to be the person who didn't come." She said, "You're talking about 2011. I said, "Yes." She said, "You came because of what happened to you." I said, "I came because you're my sister." But the part that drove 5 hours to Nashville and took a personal day and called the attorney and the forensic accountant, the part that knew exactly what to do and did it, that part was built in 2011. She was quiet. I said, "The crisis years were the worst years of my life. They were also the years that built everything I am professionally. I became a financial planner because of what happened. I built the specific expertise that has been useful to you this week because of what I went through. I know how to help people in acute financial crisis because I was in acute financial crisis and I had to figure out how to get out of it alone." She said, "I should have been there." I said, "You didn't know you were needed." She said, "I should have found out." I said, "Yes, you should have." We sat with that. Then I said, "You called me at 6:52 on a January morning. You're getting a financial planner who specializes in exactly your situation, and a family law attorney and a forensic accountant, and someone who drove 5 hours to sit at your kitchen table. You got more than most people get." She said, "I know." I said, "And you're getting it because of who I became. And I became that person because of what happened in 2011. I'm not saying it was worth it. I'm saying that both things are true." She said, "Do you forgive me?" I looked at my sister, 41 years old, sitting on her back porch in January with her marriage dissolved and her savings gone and her children asleep inside, and the specific question she had been building toward all evening, finally said. I said, I think what happened between us in those 8 years was more complicated than forgiveness and unforgiveness. I think you were lied to by someone you trusted, and I think the lie cost us 8 years, and I think that's genuinely true and genuinely terrible and genuinely not your fault in the full way I believed it was your fault. I said, I also think you could have called, and didn't, and I carry that too. She said, I know. I said, but I'm here, and I'm going to help you get through this. And after this is resolved, I think we should be in each other's lives in a way we haven't been. She said, I want that. I said, then we'll figure out what that looks like. She said, can I ask you one more thing? I said, yes. She said, the letter from Mom. Do you want to read it? I thought about this for a moment. I said, not tonight. She said, when? I said, I'll let you know. She said, okay. We stayed on the back porch for another hour in the January cold, talking about things that were easier than the things we had said, the children and her job, and what Nashville was like, and what Memphis was like, and the specific ordinary details of two lives that had been parallel for 8 years without touching. It was the best conversation we had had in 8 years. I want to tell you where things stand 11 months later, because the present is as important as the past, and I want to be honest about what the present actually is. Kevin was located in February in Phoenix, Arizona, where he had moved with a woman he had been seeing for 18 months. The forensic accounting work that James Whitmore completed in March established that the financial transfers had been occurring for 16 months, organized in a pattern designed to avoid the specific reporting thresholds that trigger bank notifications. The pattern was documented. The documentation supported Renee's legal team's approach to the divorce, which was finalized in October. The outcome of the divorce was not everything Renee needed, but it was more than Kevin had wanted her to have. The marital assets, traced through the forensic accounting, were more extensive than the $700 in her checking account had suggested. Kevin had not destroyed the assets. He had hidden them. Hidden assets are recoverable through the legal process when properly documented, and they were properly documented. Renee has an apartment now in Nashville, smaller than the house but hers. The children are at the same school. She returned to a job she had left when the youngest was born, in marketing, and she is rebuilding. I drive to Nashville once a month. Sometimes she drives to Memphis. We have had 12 conversations in 11 months that are genuine rather than managed. The specific conversations of two people who have been through something together and who are figuring out what the relationship looks like on the other side of it. I have not read the letter. I have thought about reading it many times. I think about what it would do to me to read my mother's specific words about the decision to tell Renee I wanted space, to read the specific reasoning she offered to her sister, to encounter my mother's voice in that particular mode of explaining and justifying. I have decided not to read it yet. Not because I am protecting myself from the knowledge, I already know what it says, but because reading my mother's specific words about a specific decision she made in 2011 will make her both more and less comprehensible than she is to me right now, and I am not ready for either the more or the less. I will read it eventually. I know I will. It belongs to the full picture of what happened, and I believe in having the full picture. Not yet. Here is what 8 years of estrangement and 1 January phone call and 11 months of rebuilding a sisterhood taught me. I know that the things built from the hardest years are real even when the years themselves were not what anyone would have chosen. I did not choose 2011. I would not choose it now. But I built from it a specific professional expertise and a specific personal resilience, and the particular capacity to walk into a crisis with a plan. And those things are mine even though what produced them was not chosen. The crisis years gave me something I could not have built another way, and that something was available to my sister on a Thursday morning when she had $700 and needed help. I know that the stories we tell ourselves about who chose what and who abandoned who are sometimes incomplete in ways that change the shape of the story entirely when the missing part arrives. I had spent 8 years with a specific understanding of what my family had done and what Renee had chosen, and the understanding was based on incomplete information. And when the information completed itself, the story changed shape without the original facts changing. My parents had still done what they had done. Renee had still not called. Both of these things are still true. What changed was my understanding of the difference between what Renee had chosen and what she had been told. I know that helping someone who did not help you when you needed help is not weakness and is not a performance of virtue. It is the specific decision of someone who has decided what kind of person they are going to be, independent of what other people have done or failed to do, because the decision to help is not a response to the other person's worthiness. It is an expression of who you have decided to be. I drove to Nashville because I had decided, at some point in the 8 years since the crisis, who I was going to be when called upon, and I was called upon, and I was who I had decided to be. And I know that the phone call at 6:52 on a January morning was the beginning of something rather than the conclusion of something, and that the something it began is still in process, uncertain and specific and ours in the particular new way of two sisters who are learning each other again in the years after the years that separated them, which is slower and more careful than the original learning, and also, in ways I did not expect, more complete. That is my story. A phone call at 6:52, 8 years of a specific misunderstanding, a letter in a filing cabinet, and a back porch in January where my sister and I said the things we should have said in 2011 and could only say in January, because January was when both of us were ready to say them. If this reminded you of a call you made when you had nowhere else to go, or a call you received that you almost did not answer, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that helping the people who did not help you is not something you owe them. It is something you give yourself. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.